Lesson 4, Life in the South. Build on what you know. Have you ever grown a plant from a seed or bulb? If you have, you know that plants need fertile soil, warm weather, and plenty of water. The southern colonies had all of these things. Southern agriculture. Main idea. Cash crops grew very well in the southern colonies. The long growing season and warm, damp climate of the southern colonies made the region perfect for growing tobacco and rice. Many southern planters became very wealthy exporting these cash crops to other colonies and countries. Planters found, however, that tobacco and rice needed much more work and care than other crops. Planters used indentured servants and enslaved Africans to do this hard labor. In Virginia and Maryland, the main cash crop was tobacco. Colonists grew tobacco on small farms as well as on large plantations. North Carolina had many small tobacco farms, but its greatest resource was its pine forest. Colonists took the sticky sap from the pine trees and made it into a thick liquid called pitch. Pitch was used to seal the board of ships and keep out water. South Carolina and Georgia had two main cash crops. One was rice, which flourished in the hot, wet tidewater region. Planters learned methods for growing rice from enslaved African workers. They brought their knowledge of rice growing from West Africa, where rice was an important food. The other major cash crop in South Carolina and Georgia was indigo. Indigo is a plant that can be made into a dark blue dye. This dye is used for colored clothing. Indigo was very difficult to grow, and planters had little success with it. Then 17-year-old Eliza Lucas Pinckney began to experiment with different kinds of indigo on her father's plantation. In 1744, she developed a type of indigo that was much easier to grow. This indigo was so successful that colonists in South Carolina soon sold more than 100,000 pounds of indigo each year. Charlestown. The southern colonies had many farms and plantations, but fewer towns and cities than New England or the middle colonies. By the mid-1700s, however, several ports in the South had grown into larger cities. Charlestown, South Carolina, which became known as Charleston in 1783, was the biggest southern city. It was a busy center of trade and the capital of South Carolina. In Charlestown, traders and planters sold, bought, and exported thousands of pounds of tobacco, rice, and indigo. Ships brought goods from Europe and the West Indies to sell in the colonies. Charlestown had a diverse population. Its people were English, Scots-Irish, French, and West Indian. Free and enslaved Africans lived in the city as well. Review. Why was Charlestown an important city? Plantations and small farms. Main idea. Southern plantations were large and needed many workers, but most southern colonists lived on small family farms. The huge plantations in the South were more like small villages than farms. At the center of the plantation, often near a river or stream, was the planter's house. The planter's house was surrounded by horse stables, workshops, gardens, fields, and workers' houses. Many laborers were needed to keep the big plantation running. Plantation workers were usually enslaved Africans. Most spent long hours working the plantation's fields. Other workers took care of the gardens or animals. Cooks and maids worked in the planter's house. The South was known for its large plantations, but small farms were much more common. Most southern colonists lived on small family farms in the backcountry away from the tidewater. Backcountry colonists farmed with the help of family members and perhaps one or two servants or slaves. They grew their own food and sometimes small amounts of cash crops, such as tobacco. Family life. The children of wealthy planters lived fairly easy lives. Most were educated at home. Their parents hired teachers to instruct the children in reading, writing, dancing, and music. Boys spent their free time outdoors, learning how to ride horses and hunt. Girls learned how to sew and sing. As children got older, fathers taught boys how to run the plantation. Girls learned how to manage a large household with many servants. Life was very different on backcountry farms. Backcountry farmers often lived far from schools and towns. Children learned how to read and write only if their parents could teach them. Backcountry children started helping around the house and farm at an early age. This is how they learned skills such as plowing, hunting, sewing, and cooking. Southern slavery. Main idea. Slavery was cruel, but enslaved people developed a culture that helped them survive. The importance of slavery in the southern colonies changed over time. In the early 1600s, indentured servants did much of the hard work on plantations. As the number of plantations grew, however, southern planters began to use enslaved Africans as laborers. More and more enslaved Africans were brought to North America during the 1600s and 1700s. By 1750, greater numbers of enslaved Africans lived in all 13 colonies, but most slaves lived in the southern colonies. Review. How did the children of planters and the children of backcountry farmers learn how to read and write? Life under slavery. Enslaved Africans were not treated as human beings. They were bought and sold as property. Under slavery, husbands and wives were often separated from each other and families were torn apart. On a plantation, slaves usually worked as laborers in the fields or as house servants. Even young children were forced to work. Field work was exhausting. Workers labored from morning to night in the heat and the cold, every single day of the year. Overseers sometimes whipped and punished workers to keep them working hard. An overseer is a person who watches and directs the work of other people. Enslaved people had to work so hard and had such poor food, clothing, and shelter that many died at an early age. Planters used punishments and harsh laws to keep enslaved workers from resisting or running away. Many had to wear heavy iron chains. They could not leave the plantation without permission. They could be beaten or even killed by planters and overseers. Some slaves fought back by running away. Most resisted by working as slowly as they could without being punished. African American culture. To survive their harsh lives, enslaved Africans formed close ties with each other. They created a community that was like a large family. Enslaved Africans helped each other to survive the hardships of slavery. Another source of strength was religion. Many enslaved people began to practice Christianity and looked to the Bible and its stories for inspiration. They combined Christian beliefs and musical traditions from Africa to create powerful spirituals. A spiritual is an African American religious folk song. Over time, enslaved people created a new culture that blended African and American customs and religions. They remembered their past by telling stories about their homelands in Africa. They made up work songs to help pass the time while working in the fields. They invented and played music on the banjo, a musical instrument based on African ones. In South Carolina, enslaved Africans created a new language, Gulia, out of African languages and English. Review. What did slaves do to survive the hardships of slavery? Lesson summary. The southern colonies had an agricultural economy. Most colonists lived on small family farms, but some owned large plantations that produced cash crops, such as tobacco and rice. Many slaves worked on plantations. Slavery was a cruel system. Enslaved Africans developed a culture that helped them survive. Why it matters. Slavery would become a major source of conflict in the United States more than 100 years later.